This is John Drabinsky, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone between, cultural workers, and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Aria Halliday, who teaches in the departments of Gender and Women's Studies and African American and Africana Studies at University of Kentucky. Along with a number of scholarly and public-facing essays, she is the author of two books, Black Girls and How We Failed Them from 2025 and By Black, How Black Women Transformed U.S. Pop Culture from 2022, as well as the editor of the Black Girlhood Studies collection from 2019. In this conversation, we discuss the place of gender studies and historical experience in the study of Black life, the ethics and politics of the field, and how Black studies sensibilities change the nature of research and pedagogy. Good afternoon, Aria. How are you doing today?
Hey, how are you, John?
I'm good. Midsummer heat wave in Maryland, all of those things. But I'm great. I'm so excited we found some time to talk on the Black Studies podcast together. I think the kind of work that you do is really interesting, really important in a very broad sense. But I think in particular to this podcast, I think you really speak to issues that are pressing and inventive and really transformative in Black studies. So having your voice on this podcast, having this contribution is a real gift to the series. So thank you for making the time, and I really look forward to the conversation.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I'm just going to say that, one of the reasons why I wanted to is because I think in your interview with Ashley in your 7th anniversary episode, you said about speaking to this podcast was about getting on the record, right? Being a part of the archive of the work of what Black Studies was at this moment. So I'm excited just to be here and be put on the record. Aria Halliday was here. We're here.
Yeah. We should have a little graffiti mark with the person's name was here on each of the episodes. Okay, let me look into that. We have an undergrad starting in the fall. Maybe she can make that. I like this idea. Well, we'll have a chance to talk about sort of how you imagine Black studies, study of Black life, and the relationship to your work and the kind of work you do. But I wanted to start before we get to that, I want to start with really a more personal question. Just ask you, what drew you to Black studies? What drew you to the study of Black life, in whatever sense, like your oldest sort of origins, coursework, books, teachers, all of those things. What drew you to the study of Black life? And for me, always this interesting question of what sustained you in the work.
This is a great question. I think I will start with, I have a lot of different origins, and if you read different books, they'll say different things. But I'll say that the origins probably as an undergrad at Davidson College, my first semester, I took Africanisms in anthropology course with Dr. Nancy Fairley. And I didn't know what Africanisms was. I didn't really even know what anthropology was. But we got to the...
That's a great title,
Right?
by the
It was a
way.
great
I'm
title.
sorry.
It-
I don't work on Africa, but I'm thinking I should because Africanisms, that's so actually really
It's so good.
provocative.
It
Sorry.
Oh,
Sorry to
fun.
interrupt.
And Dr. Fairley is such a fabulous teacher that she, we got into the class and she started explaining, that kind of orientation, first day conversation. And she said, this class is about thinking about the things that African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, right, Black people do all over the globe that started in Africa. And how those relationships are connected, right? Like, how do we get from, Ifa or Yoruba or, Senegalese traditions in West Africa to the stuff that we say, that we eat, the things that we care about, right, in the U.S. context. And I remember the first thing she said was the fact that you say okay, that's an Africanism. And I was like, okay.
Yeah.
And she was like, yes. And there's just
I use that with my students. They're completely baffled. They're like, wait, what?
completely
I was
and
like,
totally bad.
it's part of everyday life.
Yeah. And so, so many things, like the fact that you eat rice on a regular basis, the fact, right, all this stuff. And I was like, okay. And then I took a class, this is maybe a year and a half later, I took a class with, she was a postdoc at the time at Davidson, Dr. Lakeisha Simmons, who's at Michigan now. And she taught a class called African American Women's History. And I didn't know that there's a history that women, African American women could have, let alone that people studied, right? So we read books in that class. And I was just kind of enthralled with the idea that like you could study black women, you could study black people. Like that was a literature that we should know. That was a text as an archive that we should be a part of. And Dr. Simmons, she said, "Oh, you're really good at this research thing. You should think about, grad school. Have you thought about it?" And I was like, I was at the time planning to go to law school. I had no desire whatsoever to do this like professor thing. I don't know any professors. I don't know anybody with, anything beyond a master's. I don't know why you would do that. And she was like, "Well, just, check it out." So I did this program that she was talking about, the Institute for the Recruitment of Teachers, based at Phillips Academy in Andover. And it changed my life.
Mm,
It really did. I mean,
amazing.
there's not even a short way to say that, or a long way to say that. It just changed my life. I mean, I felt smart. I always knew I was kind of smart, but like in a room full of other smart people, and you're trying to break down Baudrillard or Althusser or Stuart Hall, Charles Wright, and you're like, and I'm like, I don't even know what these dudes are saying, but I know that what you think they're saying is wrong.
Interesting. Yeah,
And
that's awesome.
and I felt smart. I felt like, maybe I
Yeah.
do know some theory stuff. Maybe I can break this stuff down and like know what it is that black people are trying to do, what we think about, what we care about from a kind of intellectual perspective. And so I would say that's the academic trajectory of what I do. But in my book By Black, I talk about being a part of this program called Sister Friends. My mom put me in when I was like 7. That was like a black women's group in Durham, North Carolina, where I grew up. And they just taught us everything, like, Queen Nefertiti and Nefertari, and I mean, all this kind of like deep African knowledge kind of stuff that I had no concept of. And I feel like that gave me a really deep rootedness in like black people have a history and an orientation much beyond, the transatlantic slave trade and what happened to us, right? Like we have a history that's beyond the terrible things that happened that we should care about.
Yeah, I mean, I love these stories. I mean, and these accounts of coming to this area of study and these kinds of concerns broadly. And I have a special affection. I mean, because it's also my moment of thinking about, not thinking about, just even having the idea of graduate school. Somebody telling me you're good at this, you should think about it. And it's just one of those reminders. We get, as intellectuals, we have our development of our ideas, our writing, our all those things, and administering departments and responsibilities and just grading. But it's like one of those reminders that sometimes just that little half sentence like put somebody on a totally different track.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I do think that especially in the humanist fields or in area studies, that it's just littered with former law school, med school dedicated undergrads. It's really true. I just, there's so many.
That's fair.
I kind
I
of
mean,
love that.
at a
A lot of disappointed parents too.
Oh, I mean, sure. I mean, my mom thankfully is not really disappointed, but I think, when I was my best friend is a lawyer, and so when it becomes this kind of orientation, you're like, "Oh no, I didn't become a lawyer, but my best friend is." So if I need something, like I have the legal thing down. But being an academic is almost like having a legal understanding, right? In terms of like building an
Mhm.
argument and finding evidence and having to like share and convince people that this is what you do. So I say that I'm still a lawyer, just not in name.
Yeah, no, I like that. I might adopt that actually. I'll cite you every time. No, that's really interesting. Well, let me then ask you about sort of Black studies and the sort of what you understand to be the sort of responsibilities in our study of Black life. And I want to ask this in the context of the founding of the field of Black studies, which really had a tension at its origin. There was, on the one hand, student demand for a place to study Black life, that the disciplines weren't doing this, that disciplines were not in any way attending to history, literature, art, right, by African Americans in the diaspora. And Black studies was going to be where that intellectual tradition could be studied. Right. So there's that intellectual, descriptive demand, like let's give account of this. But at the same time was, of course, the radicalization in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Black liberation struggle that had really collapsed some of those ideas, those distinctions between the study of ideas and texts and political action, right? Between communities and campuses, between study and activism. And there's also that founding of Black studies that had a deep and abiding political imperative that we ought to act this way, right? We ought to be drawn into a certain kind of community and politics. So there's that prescriptive dimension, and that commitment to an intellectual tradition, commitment to a liberatory politics of community. Is that the origins of Black studies? And I'm interested, 55 or so years later, to hear people talk about how they understand the study of Black life, how they understand Black studies broadly, like what's your portrait, but also how does it relate to this tension at its origin?
That's a great question. I think I'm going to start by saying at Davidson, I was the second Black Studies major. And
Oh, really?
yes, so the
That's
very
awesome.
first one was in 1992. Her first name is not coming to me, but Molinari is her last name. She graduated the Center of Interdisciplinary Studies major in African American Studies. And I decided that I wanted to, in 2009 or so, create my own major in Africana Studies. And at the time, I got a lot of pushback from the Center of Interdisciplinary Studies director, who was a Germanist. And he was like, what is even Africana Studies? There's African American and there's, Blacks. What are you talking about, Africana Studies? And I remember I distinctively wanted to study literature because I was in a Caribbean literature class with Dr. Brenda Flanagan. That was amazing. I wanted a little bit of the literature piece. I wanted some of the sociology. I was with Dr. Hilton Kelly in sociology, and I wanted some of that. And then there was the anthropology that I already mentioned with Dr. Nancy Fairley. And then I was also started studying Arabic at the time. And so I thought I wanted to do this project about Black Muslims and the kind of decision to be kind of orthodox beyond Malcolm X in the US. And so I was like, Africana, I need the Caribbean because he's, from the Caribbean. I need, the literature. I need to know all these pieces. And I remember they were kind of adamant about not really having a demand for such a thing. They're like, Aria, we don't know what you're talking about. You can do African American studies. You do this other thing. I was like, no, I need the Caribbean. My parents are from the Caribbean. I need that. And so I did Africana Studies. And, I would say, I think it's 5 years after I graduated. I graduated in 2012. Africana Studies became a department at Davidson.
Oh, wow.
And, I'll say more than 10 years later than that, it's one of the, most majored departments on campus. And I say all that to say that at the time, no one had a concept of what Africana was. No one had an idea of what Black Studies was on that campus, beyond, a couple of projects here and there. And I did a research project where I went to small liberal arts colleges like Rhodes College in Memphis. I went to Washington and Lee in Virginia and Davidson and compared the fact that Davidson still didn't have a Black Studies program in comparison to these other places that are just as white, that are just as, liberal arts minded. So what's wrong with us? And that's kind of, I think, part of what pushed it forward. But I had to make the argument that Africana Studies meant wherever Black people are, that is worthy of study, right? If we could have, and I tell people now that if we can still have reams and reams of paper on William Shakespeare, right? Books and books and books, then how many books do we need about the experiences of Black people regardless, right? There's so many other things that we need to write. And so for me, I think Black Studies is, wherever the experiences of Black people are, right? If that's on Mars, we can go to Mars and talk about it, right? That's still Black Studies. If we're talking about the literature, we're talking about the culture, are we talking about the interactions with other people? Are we talking about language? All of that is Black Studies. And I think, to do the work well, we have to actually be attuned to all of those pieces.
Yeah, no, I love that way of putting it. Wherever Black people are, that is worthy of study. I think that way of just cutting through lots of the ways that we might try to modify or over theorize the sort of first statement. I mean, that as like a first principle that's so well put, because it's like, I think about the Germanist, right, saying like, what even is this? Which, by the way, as a Germanist, I'm like, you should know better
He
than
knows
to
better now, but at the time.
yeah, well, I mean, Germany's history of dealing with difference not great, but more not. I don't want to say more seriously, but back to your point. But that what is it even? That's such a. I mean, it's such a question that I think we all get in the field,
Yeah.
and that to bring somebody, because it's always a skeptical question. It's rarely inquisitive, but when it's that skeptical question, you really bring people to a crossroads. Do you think where Black people are is worthy of study or not?
Mhm.
But also there's such depth in the study part of that. I really love that. And it's deeply political, as you were articulating. It's like, that's a political statement when someone says that doesn't seem like it's a real thing, and it's a political statement to say it is.
Right,
It's
and that's
absolutely
great
transformative.
about the development of and which is why I included the story, the development of the department was that they would say, "Well, there's no demand," right? There wasn't student demand for this, therefore, we don't need to build it as faculty. And I'm like, "Well, perhaps there isn't
Mhm.
student demand because they don't see a pathway to make it happen." If you say it's available to them, they'll say, "Oh, I want to minor in that. I want to major in that." Well, we know that now. But in 2009, right, the argument was students aren't protesting about this. Like, why do we need to care? And then me and my friends started to protest about it. So,
Yeah. It's amazing how
you know,
it's amazing the category of things that are, quote, no demand,
Mhm.
when they don't exist. It's like,
Yeah.
yes, imagine there's no
They were
demand for a
nice
thing that
about
doesn't
it.
exist.
They were nice about it until we interrupted convocation. So, you know.
Well, I mean, look, I think it's really important um, to always know the names of the people who founded the department that you're in, because they took real risks, and how you felt about it and how you thought about it is your story. But in the end, it's 18 to 22-year-olds taking on an institution and their professors. I mean, takes courage.
Mm.
I mean, 18 to 22-year-olds are also like largely reckless, but this is where it's like
Generally.
extremely interesting and productive. It's like they're willing to take these chances that a 40-year-old to be like,
Yeah.
and I think knowing those names, and so I'm sure you love that you were a part of that story. So, and I will say also, having taught at a selective liberal arts college for years, there's nothing that moves a slack towards action like telling them that their rivals do it.
Oh, absolutely. After I did that research project, there was movement. And then, we interrupted convocation a few times, protested, did some stuff like that. Things changed. But I was going to say too, though, that I remember I actually, and I'll say this on the record, right? I interviewed for a job in that department soon after I graduated with my PhD, and I was told I was not Africana studies enough.
That's a Jesus take the wheel moment. It's like, wow.
Which, I mean, when we, get to my research, maybe I'll explain a little bit more about that. But it's very interesting the ways that, as one of the people or the first major of the department, which they celebrate, right? I can't get a job in the only department that I I helped found. So that's
Fascinating. Well, I mean, so let me ask you then. I mean, maybe to lead to this, or really get to the heart of it. Your work is this really important and compelling mix of cultural sensibilities and visual studies, critical work on race and gender, and it just so many potent insights for the field of Black studies come out of that mixture. I think it's like a really dynamic collection of interests. And so I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit about how you see your work in relation to the history of Black studies. Where does it fit? Right? How do you see it as continuing something in the tradition, if you do? But also, I'm always interested in how people see their work opening new horizons or really pushing new boundaries in the field.
Yeah. I would say initially when I first started writing about my senior thesis in undergrad was about Black women, Caribbean women's memoir. And I remember writing about June Jordan and Audre Lorde and Constance Baker Motley and Jamaica Kincaid and some of these other folks, and I was thinking about the experiences that Black women had that made them, move to the US. It was really the like point of contention I was interested in. And then I realized most of them had these instances where they were 6 or 7 or 8 or 9, where they had this kind of like radicalization moment, where they realized that the world did not work for them, that it did for many other people. And June Jordan in her memoir talks about, I didn't want it to be like this. I became a soldier that day. I became a soldier to, the project of social justice in that moment. And I think, my work is hopefully an attempt at recovering childhoods for people. Um,
Mm.
but in the tradition, I think of many radical Black women, authors and speakers and theorists who, you know, Ida B. Wells and Anna Julia Cooper and, Angela Davis or whatever, they're looking backwards to find out what Black women before them were doing, but they're also thinking about what the Black girls and women are going to do 20 years from now, 40 years from now,
Mhm.
50 years from now. And so I think that in the simplest way, right? I'm trying to do the same work that I think Black feminists have been doing, and maybe Black women who maybe wouldn't claim the feminist label have been doing since the beginning of time, right? Making the world better for girls like them, and also thinking about what struggles got me here, right? What do people have to do to open a door for me?
That's wonderfully put, and I love that that touch you put on it, right? Not only continuing the sort of work that Black feminists have done, who have always been both at the center and the margins of the field of Black studies. I mean, it's easy to say, no voices, but I mean, Sonia Sanchez was one of the founders, but that working, both at the center and the edge, but also, as you said, the kind of work that's done that we don't call Black studies, right? As centuries old work. I love that. That's great. Great kind of witness to this stuff that you're doing. Well, you know, sort of continuing with that, I'm also interested, that you're to hear you talk about your work that because your work has never really been in disciplines, right? That your graduate work was in an American Studies department. That's not a disciplinary education, right? Your teaching position now is the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies and also African American Africana Studies. And you talked about your undergraduate work being a design major in Africana Studies. And I'm interested how you think that trajectory where you didn't pass through a discipline and come to Black studies, right? But you really came in multidisciplinary spaces to the work that you do. How you think that's shaped the idea of a research project, shaped your research broadly, but also I'm always interested if people have thoughts on how it shapes how you approach a classroom.
Yeah. Um, I would say 2.5 years into my master's program, we were hiring a new director of American Studies at Purdue. And we hired this, he's going to laugh when we hear this, but this kind of weird guy named Ray Boucher, who is, he himself has a PhD in technology studies, which is his own interdisciplinary kind of project. And I remember I was really interested in him because he said, my job is to help you figure out your question so you can go discover the answer, right? Like, and
Mm.
be drawn to the question, not necessarily to like the objects that then can create a question for you. And that's something I try to attend to in everything that I do. Like, what's the question? And then what might help me answer that question? What might help me get to something that feels like an answer if there is one? Who can I ask? What do I need to read? What do I need to watch? What do I need to engage? Right, to help me get to something that feels like an answer. And I think that I've always kind of tried to do that. Even now talking about my major in Africana Studies as an undergrad, right? I was trying to think about the literature, the sociology, the education, right? I was always kind of doing multidisciplinary work. I didn't know that. Because I was just interested in a thing. And I was like, how do I get to the thing that I care about?
Mm-hmm.
These all of these disciplines have things that I like, but they also missing some things I think I need, right? I can't do sociology without history. I can't do literature without education. Like all of these things have to go together. And so I would say now that I'm a cultural studies scholar, I think about culture a lot. I think about the ways that we are um, and create and hate on culture, how it makes us.
Mhm.
And I think that in a classroom, that's part of my deal too. I ask my students to think about the things that they love, right? One of my biggest points of contention is that we have a week on Beyonce, and the students early on don't ever want to talk negatively about her. There's nothing negative about Beyonce. You can't say terrible things about her. And I'm like, well, Beyonce's not here. I think you're allowed to say things of her,
Yes.
but also
Hopefully.
like my job is to teach you that even when you love a thing, you have to be able to critique it, right? That actually there
Mhm.
is love in critique. Because that's how we get better. That's how we learn. That's how we grow. And that's how we actually differentiate ourselves from other people. It lives in that critique. And I think, in the Black study space, um, we've always had that critique. And I think, to do the work of Black studies is to ask the question, like, why aren't we being taught about, the ways of the Igbo people in West Africa, which is like kind of imperative of a lot of early Black study stuff. Like, why don't we know what's going on the continent? Okay, why don't we know? Well, okay, first we need to find out why, but also we should also just like start learning because who's going to stop us? And I and I think
Mhm.
that's my orientation. Going back to your question earlier about like the political stakes of it, right? That like until someone tells me I can't, I mean, that's what we're gonna do.
Yeah. Um, I love that character, that framing of, the things we love, we're still critical of. I have a similar kind of conversation with my students, especially when I teach cinema classes or we have sections on music or, culture that they're used to consuming.
Yeah.
Right. I often show them films that they have a hard time consuming because they have subtitles. Um, but but the consumption model and enjoyment rather than love and criticism at the same time, it's really interesting to bring them to that space. I mean, I always just ask them like, who do you love most in the world? Do you have any criticisms of them? And they're always like, my mother. And no, I have no criticisms. So I was like, really? Never gets on your nerves? Oh, come on. Okay. Um, but but really I think what I connected with and just think is so important to emphasize for you to have emphasized for us is the way working in this multidisciplinary space is about a particular approach to a question and the way the questions lead us to whatever can answer that. I really love that way of putting it. And I make intro podcast connections whenever possible, but my collaborator Ashley did a really fantastic conversation with Vince Brown, and Vince talked about in that exact way that Black Studies had sort of liberated his imagination as an historian, or just gave space for a liberated imagination, I should say, in the sense of he would just ask his question and then whatever helped him answer. And so you were almost saying, verbatim. I was just hearing that podcast again, and I think it picks up on such an important feature of Black Studies, which makes it not only interesting and adventurous and frankly like really fun, like as a scholar. I mean, you can take on so many things, but also the immense amount of work that we have to do in order to be, because it's not like, oh, I just pick this up and use it. It's like, well, in order to read this book and understand this book or this text or this film or this sound, there's all this other stuff we have to do. And I say that because I think that Black Studies, like all area studies, really gets derided as not as serious as a discipline. And these are these moments where I'm like, no, in some ways it's harder because you cannot just simply say, I'm looking for this kind of evidence. I'm following to whatever helps me. I mean, do you feel like was that for you like what American Studies sort of gave you the skill set for, or was it really coming to American Studies and doctoral study? It was like just affirmed a kind of orientation you had in the world.
I think that first of all, I should say I didn't know what American Studies was, right? IRT, the program requires that you apply to 10 PhD programs. I applied to Africana Studies at Brown. I applied to Berkeley. I applied to a bunch of places. And then the founder of IRT is a guy named Kelly Wise, rest in peace, Kelly. And he said, well, you should think about American studies at Purdue. And I was like, American studies, Purdue, these two things do not go with Aria. Like, these things are not good. This doesn't feel like a place I should be, because I was, like, dead set on going to, like, Africana at Brown. I was like, "Oh, yes, this is, like,
Yeah.
again, Africana, this is, like, where I thought my brain was going." I was obsessed with Keisha Perry at the time. I was like, "Okay, this is what I should be doing." And he said, "No, I think you should check it out." And I would say that American Studies was the best place for me at the time, especially because I didn't really know disciplinary-wise what I was even trying to do, right? I didn't know I was a cultural studies
Mm,
scholar. I didn't know I was interested in this kind of question of girlhood. I didn't know. I just was like, I know that there's this thing that I'm reading in this literature of Black women, that I'm reading in the autobiographies of Black women, that I'm, like, really curious about, and who's gonna let me study it?
yeah.
Like, who's gonna let me get there? And I think American Studies gave me some confidence about the fact that, like, there's a method to that, right? It might sound
Yeah.
like there's kind of just whatever's washing over you at any given moment, but there's a kind of method and a kind of voraciousness that you have to have about what you're working on to, like, really say, okay, well, I don't know, maybe a TV show might help me answer this question, or maybe, this documentary, maybe I need to be in the archives in Australia to answer this question. Maybe, this museum exhibit will answer it. And I think that, like, trying to explain, right, as a PhD student, why I'm doing all this stuff was a lot harder. Now I feel much more confident that, like, this makes sense because it makes sense. I don't know how
Mhm,
to
mhm,
explain it more
mhm.
than that.
Yeah. And you put in that word that's so important, method, that there is a method to this, finding the sources, following the sources that are helpful and all of that. And that training in, I just think there's such an important difference, and I won't say a hierarchy, but an important difference between those of us, myself, who came through a discipline and then had to learn the methods that make it possible to be multidisciplinary, and the people who begin with that as already a kind of method. So, um, yeah, and the Brown Africana Studies program, I think that was the destination for a lot of people. They never took enough people for everybody to live their dream.
No, I was waitlisted and still may be waitlisted.
Yeah, well, their loss. Um, well, let me ask a sort of big speculative question. One of the sort of last two questions for you. Um, Over the past 5+ decades, what do you think Black Studies has done well? But also, what do you think it has not done particularly well?
Ooh, uh, I think Black Studies has done the, like, radical political orientation well. I think even through this kind of process of institutionalization, I think the best work in Black studies is still, right, very interested in the kind of historical radical work that Black people have always done. And I think, for me, a lot of the most exciting stuff that's coming out in the past couple of years, is about that radical tradition, especially like the turn of the 20th century moment, right? Like, Black people finally kind of got their feet underneath them. They're working, we have kind of industrialization happening. What are Black people doing? All of that work that's happening in that early kind of 1900s period, I think is just really fascinating to me. Natalia Duncan's An Efficient Womanhood just came out, and I think I'm just so excited to read it because I'm like, this is my jam. Black women in the early 20th century, this is where I want to be. So I'm super excited about that. And I think that the Black women scholars, I won't necessarily always say that they're Black feminists, but Black women scholars across the board, I think, have done a really great job in being interested and curious about the happenings of Black folks in that period, and what that actually means. I think we've also done well, kind of the ecological and environmental conversations. One of my good friends, Chelsea Frazier at Cornell, is always thinking about that eco-feminist conversation. What are we doing with the planet? How are we a part of the planet? How is it connected to us? I think Black Studies has done those kind of conversations well, which is, I think, arguably also a part of that political orientation. Um, I think we've actually done gender and sexuality well. I think it's been buried a bit. That's maybe the asterisk I'll put on saying that we've done it well.
That's interesting way to put it. Yeah.
I think it's always been there. I think people have always been curious and interested. Like, I don't think you can do Black studies without Barbara Christian. I don't think you can do, the work that we want to do without Angela Davis. Right? So Black women have always been there, whether or not we want to include them in the archive, whether or not we want to support financially their work, whether or not we want to bring them to our campuses. That's a whole nother conversation. But I would say that the work has always been there and it's been successfully done. Um, I think we could do better about kind of differentiating the experiences of Black women and Black men, of Black trans people and Black queer people. I think we could do better thinking about conversations like age. I think Habiba Ibrahim's book, Black Age, that came out maybe a year or two ago, is probably the first book that really does that well. And I think, that means we got to do more. We got to really think about what age means as a part of these other conversations. I think also, of course, we're based in the US. We're very US based in our conversations about Black studies in the US. I think we could do better about thinking about those relationships between and among and disparate of Black people across the globe. I think, like, for example, I don't know about, I'm sure it exists, but I don't know enough about Black people in China. I don't know enough about Black people in Australia. I don't know enough about Black people in Nova Scotia, right? I think there could be more work. I think there could be better work. I think there could be, more of us are attuned to those conversations in real ways. And I think that sometimes we get kind of muddled in the kind of white supremacist orientation to like know everything, and it flattens out, right? The diversity of experiences that Black people have. So I would think that we need to do that better.
Yeah, well, to quote a scholar, Black studies is really about where Black people are. That's worthy of study. So really pulled that. I feel like we should end right here because that was really pulled it nice together. I think that I think there's something really interesting to contemplate about, like, why there's been, less attention than I think you're right. So less attention than should have been paid to differentiation, distinction, difference. Like, what motivated that? How do you start a field of Black studies in an anti-Black world that doesn't want Black people to exist? And how do you negotiate both, persisting as a field, an area of study and documentation, but also attend to all these differences that might actually not. I don't know quite what the image would be, but a kind of version of like splintering the concept, right? To like moving it out in multiple directions. That's been such a, I think about women and gender studies has struggled with that as well. The desire, like, woman must mean this thing, and really been pushed out of that. I think particularly by, emphases on queerness and trans identity. And, that moment, I think it's really in Black studies and happening now that I think will speak to, is speaking to what you're talking about, which is maybe that next horizon of the field, right? To rethink, constantly be rethinking the Black and Black studies.
Yeah, I think so.
So maybe that's an answer already to this question. But my last question for you is, in a Black studies context, what do you think is the issue we should all be thinking about, or what's the question you would want us to all be asking?
I think a question that I am sitting with and kind of finish my most recent book, Black Girls and How We Fail Them, on is, how do we make the world more conducive to the most vulnerable of us?
That is a fantastic place to end, and could not be more timely in 2025. In all seriousness, when you said, part of what got you interested in being on the podcast was, making a mark on an historical record, that question for us right? That moral demand on us is just so attuned to this particular moment. So thank you for that. That's a really wonderful place to end, and a really compelling thing for us to all think about. How do we situate ourselves in relation to it? So I was really looking forward to this conversation. It's been so fantastic. So thank you so much for your time and your thoughtfulness. These insights, observations, thoughts, analyses, however you want to put it, in this episode are really going to be a profound contribution to the series. So thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I have fun.
All right. Well, have a great rest of your day.
You too.
Take care.